with another great episode of Meeting with the Minds. Today we're here with the great Charles Coulombe, author, theologian, scholar, comedian, you name it, he's got it. So Charles, thank you very much for coming on the show. A lot of my friends are a little bit concerned because now I'm starting to sound like a little bit of a monarchist, and I think you might be to blame for that.
Heavens to Betsy. Well, firstly, let me say I'm here under false pretenses. I was told it was meeting of the minds. And I had a whole routine where, oh, never mind. Anyway, no, well, I'm sorry to hear that your friends are getting overwrought. And I understand how they feel. Whenever we hear about monarchy, as Americans, we immediately think of an oppressive system that would confine us to our houses, prevent us from going to mass, shut down all the shops. Oh, wait a minute. You know, maybe this isn't the best time to talk about oppression, but no, I honestly, it does crack me up a little bit, not just because of the obvious pandemic thing, but firstly, whenever people hear monarchy, they are trained, if they're Americans, they're trained from birth to associate it with oppression. Right. But you got to bear a couple of things in mind. Firstly, that imagine, if you will, that you identified republic in your mind with Hitler and Idi Amin.
Right.
You know, well, Hitler was voted into power, so all republics are bad. I mean, that's a screwy way to think of anything. But that's the way people think about monarchy.
Right.
And they're trained to. I mean, you probably never saw it because it's like really old and stuff, not unlike me. But when I was a kid, we had something called Schoolhouse Rock.
I've heard it. I've seen some of it before.
Well, there's a particular one that I love because it epitomizes what we're supposed to believe if we're products of government schooling. And it's called No More Kings.
Right.
You pull that up and have a watch afterwards. I mean, it's hysterical. And the best part of it is at the end, when freedom is dawned and we're the great beacon of freedom we are now, there's a voice going, no more kings. We got to have a president. No more kings. He'll do what the people want. No more king. Yeah. Okay, well, we actually believe that on a certain level, even though our experience, to say nothing of empirical reality, says that's not really how things worked. You know, Henry VIII, who most Catholics think of when they think of monarchy, most American Catholics immediately think of Henry VIII. He's the go-to guy. You know, he's kind of like Hitler for monarchists.
Right.
He's the go-to guy for a monarchist when he thinks about a republic. He immediately thinks of Hitler being elected. You know, that's, well, we all have to have our go-to villains.
Right.
So for Catholic monarchists, it's Henry VIII. But here's the funny thing about Henry VIII, and mind you, I've no doubt he's frying in hell deservedly, but he could not alter the laws on marriage to make himself a polygamist.
Right.
We can, and we have. He could not declare a whole bunch of human beings no longer human. But our masters have. There has never been a quote-unquote absolute monarch. And mind you, what we call absolute monarchy, I consider to be something of a corruption of the system. But nevertheless, there was no absolute monarch who had the power that either our president or our Supreme Court have to make up law out of their rear ends.
And I think a lot of,
what's that?
And I think a lot of people don't realize that. People think absolute power with the monarchy. Are there limits placed on their power within the monarchy?
Well, firstly, look at the only remaining quote unquote absolute monarchy you know of right now, which is the Holy See. The interesting thing about the current pontificate is not the wild stuff he's doing, because frankly, Pope Francis is a typical cleric of his generation. I grew up with them. I saw what they did. I saw how they were. They wanted to change the church and remake it in their own image. And if you didn't like it, they'd smack you around. That's what I grew up with. That's what I've lived with. As I got older, those of them that didn't leave the priesthood became bishops, and one of them had to become pope. I mean, it's chronologically, there was no other way. But what we see in his pontificate are the limits of his ability to change things. Now, don't get me wrong. There's all sorts of things he can do that are unpleasant and has done. But at the end of the day, he's been unable to change things fundamentally. And that is the thing about quote unquote absolute monarchs. As I say, Henry VIII ripped England from the bosom of the church, but he had to do so under a pretense of legality. There were things he could not do. And he was a very rare exception, just like Hitler is kind of rare as an elected head of government. Most Republican heads of government are not Hitler. It's true. They really aren't. It's interesting to me, again, that we have this doublethink in our heads.
Right.
The reality we live in versus the theory behind it.
Okay.
We think that because we vote, that somehow makes a difference. Okay, all right, no, I'll go with that. And what has it made a difference for anything you wanted?
Right.
I'll take it a step further. We have a system that encourages us to look at the national scene almost entirely, the state scene a bit. There's a twofold problem with that. Firstly, your vote, qua your vote, doesn't mean much on the national level. If it weren't for the Electoral College, it wouldn't mean anything at all if you lived in flyover country.
Right.
But with the Electoral College, they've got to go out there every 4 years and pretend they care about the flyover people. But anyway, makes them feel good. But the truth is that you've got no real voice. Your vote, rather, has no real value at the national level. Only a little at the state level, unless it's a small state. If you live in Delaware or Rhode Island, your vote means a lot more than if you live in New York or California. Now, take it a step further, your vote means a lot more at the county level.
Right.
And a lot more still at the city level, unless you live in New York City or LA or Chicago. But if you live in a suburb of those cities, your vote could mean a lot, precisely because most people who live in suburbs of New York or LA or Chicago don't participate at all in municipal elections. Now, the funny thing about that is that that's where the majority of the laws you live under are actually passed. And yet we ignore it. How many people who live in, Passaic know the name of their mayor?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good point.
Good point indeed. It's what I call the tyranny of the involved. If you show up, you're part of the deal. And mind you, my hometown in California, my residence, I should say, I wasn't raised there, but I've lived there for, 9 to 30 years till I moved here. It's a very well-run town. It really is. But that's because it's run by a sort of coalition of preservationists and shopkeepers, the downtown businesses and the preservation people. And they like each other because the preservation people are what bring people into the main street of the town. And the merchants of the main street of the town make money for people who come to gawk at the beautiful architecture. So it's a well-run town because the people who have an interest in keeping it that way keep it that way. But we, in the LA area, in towns like Maywood and Bell and all that, we've had these excruciating scandals where these almost self-elected groups of people, remember these towns, although few people vote in them, everybody pays municipal taxes.
Yeah.
And if you've got a town where most people aren't even citizens, they're not voting, but they're still getting taxed. If only sales taxes and so forth.
Right.
And so in places like Maywood and Bell, we've had these huge scandals where the city councils and mayors were pulling millions of dollars out of these poor immigrants. and getting themselves huge homes and all that. And, you looked at the thing and you wondered, my gosh, if they'd been plowing those millions into the infrastructure, the schools and libraries those people would have had. But see, a huge chunk of the population of those towns weren't voters. And of those that did, I mean, even in my town, maybe 10% vote.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. I guess just we think so much about whoever's ruling the country, right? Who's the leader of the country? So maybe I don't know if we've been brainwashed into thinking that, or if there's some truth to it. I think a lot of people might think like doing like the republic, the democratic republic, or whatever we have, right? It's almost like hedging your bet. Like, yeah, in theory, a monarchy would be good, but in practice, one corrupt monarch can ruin the whole thing. I think that's what a lot of people think. So let's hedge our bets.
all right, well, the problem, of course, is we have a system that's already corrupted and isn't going to change. Again, there was no great monarch of the past whose hands were bloody with millions of unborn infants.
Right.
The thought would never have occurred to them. And through our taxes, we support that murder.
Right.
I hate to bring reality home to anyone.
It's true. It's true.
We, but it's okay because it's democratic and we get to vote. And if we don't like the man in charge, we can change him. Well, no, you could vote for whomever you're given to vote for.
Yeah.
And usually people will tell you, well, I vote for the lesser of two evils. Well, stop. Why is it always that way? Why? The lesser of two evils is still evil. And I mean, Mr. Trump, God bless him, for all of his benefits, he's not going to roll back gay marriage. The federal government is still celebrating Pride Month.
Yeah.
If you go to the National Park System's website, which I love, by the way, both the national parks and the website, just so you'll know. But you'll find a big section on LGBTQ history and the sites associated therewith that Mr. Obama put in place, and which Mr. Trump is never going to do anything about.
Right.
Now, so again, let's keep their mouths moving. Well, we're free. At least we don't have a king. Okay, good. Glad you believe that. But then again, there's a second element to it. It was a chap called Arthur Müller-Vandenbroek. There's a name for you. And he was no Nazi, I have to say, quite the opposite. But he, unfortunately for himself, had a phrase that he invented ripped off by the Nazis, and it was the Third Reich. He was writing just after World War I. The First Reich, of course, was the Holy Roman Empire. The Second Reich was Kaiser Wilhelm's Reich. And he said, well, there's the coming Reich, the Third Reich. He was right. It just wasn't anything like what he would have hoped for. But I mentioned him because he had a phrase in that book, which I've never forgotten. It was, the Germans ceased to have kings when they ceased to be a kingly people. So it could be that we do have the form of government we deserve. Perhaps we should be run like sheep and milked like cows. Maybe that's who we are. We've tolerated abortion. We've tolerated gay marriage. We've tolerated everything from gender issues to safe spaces. There's a conference going on at Harvard University, our very best, on whether or not the nuclear family should be abolished. Well, okay, maybe this is the kind of governance we deserve.
Yeah. Although I guess, what about the founders and framers of America, right? They kind of say that this doesn't work. This constitutional government doesn't work if we don't have a moral citizenry. So could they say that as like, well, it's the same thing we're saying for the monarchy. So all things being equal, then which one's better? Let's assume you had a moral citizenry. And what about if we don't have a moral citizenry? If we hold those things, yeah.
At the risk of being funny, I can't help myself. Remember that the founding fathers were the last generation of statesmen we had raised under a monarchy. And we've never had one as good since.
Okay.
They ensured that a generation like theirs would never be raised again. Because all the presuppositions and so forth that they were raised with went out the window when they took over and reorganized. And of course, I have to give them a lot of credit because they were very clever men. They really were. They were faced with 13 new states that were totally disunited in terms of religion, and that had only had as a unifying element the image of the king. They got rid of that. So what do you replace it with? Well, they were very smart. I mean, I don't say it was a good thing. I don't say it was even virtuous, but I say it was smart and it worked. And that is, they invented, specifically people like Noah Webster, who also gave us our unique spelling. They invented the religion of the country, whereby the Pilgrim Fathers were like the Old Covenant. The Founding Fathers themselves were the New Covenant. The Constitution was brought by the Holy Ghost. The Liberty Bell and the flag were sacred, and so on and so forth. Well, this quasi-religiosity was grafted on to a moral code, to a moral consensus, because all the many kinds of Protestants and the Catholics and the Jews all thought more or less that the same things were right and wrong.
Yeah.
And so they developed a system whereby adulation of the country became a quasi-religious thing. And what they didn't foresee was A, the shattering of that moral consensus in the 60s, and B, the fact that if the very notion of religion itself begins to wane, what happens to a quasi-religion of the state? If you no longer have any idea of the sacred, well, then how could the Liberty Bell and the flag be sacred?
Right.
So it's true that they used to go on about needing both an educated and a moral citizenry to maintain it. But the problem was that they also knew that that's a very difficult thing to get.
Right.
It doesn't really happen often. I mean, it's rather like my saying, here's a pistol for you. If you're completely trained in its care and maintenance, it'll never explode in your hands.
Right.
Well, okay.
That's right.
That's great if you really know how to take care of the pistol. But if not, your son or your grandson or your great grandson,
Right.
bloody thing's going to go off. And
Yeah.
you should have realized that when I gave you the gun. You really should have.
Yeah.
I told you it was a Saturday night special. I said you got to be real careful.
Oh, right.
But having said all of that, and despite, although I recommend my book highly, it's funny how that works. I recommend everything I've ever written.
I just bought it. Star Spangled Crown. I just purchased it.
That's the one. Have you read it?
Not yet.
No, well. Sorry.
I started reading the introduction, and I watched the 29-part series on Tumblr House.
Oh,
with,
boy.
How to Become a Monarchist.
Oh, gee willikers. Well, suffice to say that although I shouldn't, this is a spoiler alert. I highly doubt anything remotely like what I predict is actually going to come to pass. The reason being that a Catholic monarchy is the product of a Catholic people.
Right.
Now, conceptually, it could happen, I suppose, that if this country ever did get Catholic leadership, because inevitably people do follow their leaders. We did see that with Henry VIII and his successors.
Right.
We saw that with North Africa and Egypt and the Near East, or why they became Muslim. So it change can come from the top up, but it is certainly more pleasant and more secure when it comes to the bottom.
Right.
I mean, in the case, for instance, the conversion of the Roman Empire, we think of Constantine, we think of Theodosius the Great. And it's also important to bear in mind that by the time Constantine legalized Christianity, there were already an awful lot of Christians in the empire.
Yeah.
I mean, it was certainly certainly the largest single religion in the empire by the time Constantine legalized it. You give that a missionary impulse, and by the time Theodosius the Great in 376 says, all right, gang, it's going to be the official religion of the empire, and baptism makes you a citizen. By the time he said that, it was the majority. It really couldn't have worked easily the other way.
Yeah.
I mean, if it had, there would have had to have been huge pagan persecutions. And despite what our Wiccan friends will say, there's no record of huge pagan persecutions under the Roman Empire.
Right. Now, weren't there Roman emperors who were they had a monarchy but not based on lineage? And is that better?
Well, the modern examples we have to choose from are Poland and the Holy Roman Empire until the Habsburgs took over. And the answer is not really. Not really, because the instability that comes in is enormous. And again, the other problem you've got with I mean, whether you do it hereditary or you do it via election, you're always going to have problems. There is no perfect solution to human governance because there is no perfect solution to anything human.
Right.
There is no perfect solution, for instance, to child abuse in the church any more than there is in the Boy Scouts or school education. Why? Because human nature has a corrupt side to it. And in every age, people who can and who are driven sufficiently will misuse their positions.
I guess that
It's
founding fathers got that right. At least that, or Madison saying men aren't angels. At least he got that part right.
Well, he did. I mean, as I say, he was, you got to remember that when we say the founding fathers, that's a huge grab bag of beliefs and so on.
Yeah.
So when people say, the founding fathers were all deists, that's not true. The founding fathers were all good Christians. That's not true. A lot of them were deists.
Right.
A lot of them were believing Protestants. Some of them were both. To figure out how you can be both a deist and a believing Protestant, I leave to people who are. Call your nearest Unitarian church and ask them, and they'll tell you. You know what you get when you cross a Unitarian with a Jehovah's Witness, don't you?
What?
Someone who rings your doorbell for no reason. Hi? But
I cut you off. You were saying about the difference between a monarchy with a lineage versus
right. Hereditary versus elected.
Yeah.
And again, the only elected monarchy that's lasted for a great length of time is the Holy See.
Okay.
And that, it's certainly been far from perfect, right. But it's managed to survive. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth as an elected monarchy really didn't last very long.
Yeah.
And it ended up being partitioned for its worries. That leaves us with the Holy Roman Empire, which was elected initially from members of the same family. Then it got into this, after the death of Frederick II, you got into this horrible interregnum. And then out of that came the Habsburgs.
Okay.
So I mean, similarly, people have asked you, well, gee, couldn't you have a Catholic republic? And so on. So theoretically, of course you could.
Yeah.
And you've had a few attempts at it, none of which have lasted long. Because you're dealing, I would say, with certain inherent contradictions. The thing is that a republic is of its nature unstable. If you're elected, at the end of the day, you're the leader only of the people that elected you,
Okay.
of the faction elected you. Take the United States right now. Let's pretend for a minute that Mr. Trump were the most wonderful person who had ever lived and all his intentions were good. Well, that's nice, but at the end of the day, he can really only be the president of the people who elected him. And this is true, it was true of Mr. Obama. Now, we have had a very few presidents who have been able to play the role of nonpartisan leader of the country, usually during war.
Yeah.
And even then, there are always a ton of people disaffected by their conduct of the war, whichever war it is. I don't care if we're talking about the Mexican War, the War of 1812, the Civil War, World War I, World War II. You'll always have people who are not pleased with the way the war is being handled. Or for that matter, with how or why we got into the war in the first place. So you'll always have faction in human affairs, but the trick is try to make those factions not fight over the basis of the state itself.
Okay.
In other words, to put this another way, it's like parties in New York, in say in New York, in the New York City.
Yeah.
It's better that you have two different factions who agreed
Right.
about the way the city should be run. It's just a question of who's going to do the running, you or me.
Right.
If you have one side that says, well, the city of New York should be run the way it's always been run, and you have got another set who say, nah, we should abolish the counties and boroughs and just have a single centralized government out of City Hall, and that's what we want. Well, you would immediately have two irreconcilable viewpoints, and sooner or later a setup like that, a house divided against itself, cannot stand.
Right. And then wouldn't the pushback be then? Well, the king may only serve himself and his family.
Well, that takes us again to the issue of training. I don't know any politician who doesn't think that way, number one. So basically, you're already expecting a higher standard than you accept in real life.
Good point.
Well, you know they're at the trough, and yet I don't want a king because he won't be better than what I already accept.
Right.
There's an argument for you. But the truth is that a king cannot think about things quite the way a president can and must, or I should say a politician in general, because every politician, unless he's really good, wants to be president.
Right.
I don't care if he's your city councilman. He daydreams about being president, unless he's really good, in which case he daydreams about being the best city councilman you ever had.
Yeah.
But if he does, he's in a decided minority. There are such people. I want to make plain that there are politicos who are really keen simply on doing the job they're in. You know what I mean? They really do exist.
Yeah.
But by and large, they're not the majority. Let me put it this way. A king is trained from birth to be a king. His authority comes, if it's a Catholic monarchy, it comes from the church, and it comes from the nation itself, from the very foundation of the country. You'll see, I talk about that in Star Spangled Crown. One of the problems with that for a king in the United States is that we don't have really an obvious monarchical tradition.
Right.
I say an obvious monarchical tradition. I don't mean to say we don't have one, because we do. We have several, actually. That's part of the problem. But, I mean, right now, for instance, in beautiful Long Island, you know what they've discovered?
What?
That the beaches in Southampton and East Hampton are still under the Duke's laws. The your board of chosen freeholders in Jersey, or
Yeah.
frozen cheeseholders, as some call them. You know where that name comes from?
Where?
It comes from the monarchy, because only freeholders could vote. And so their chosen freeholders ran the counties. You've frozen on me.
How about let me move this thing a little bit? How about now? Okay. Or
All right.
go ahead.
Well, now you're frozen, but all right. Now you're better. You're alive again. All right. So, but to finish answering that question, frozen once more. All right. Now you're alive. You keep going back and forth.
I keep pulling this computer out further. Maybe it'll get a better signal here. Okay.
Well, are you able to hear me?
I can hear you fine.
What's that?
I can hear you fine. You
All
sound
right.
great.
I'll keep talking and I'll try not to look at the freezing. So, no, the thing is that the training of a king is perforce very different from the training of a politician. And it's a very different ethos, you know. Mutatis mutandis, a priest is very different from a Protestant minister. And I don't just mean, you know, the first thing you'll think of is celibacy. No. A Catholic priest, even a married priest like Byzantine Rite, Anglican Ordinariate. My godson is a married Anglican Ordinariate priest, but he's one of the best Catholic priests I know. The ethos of a priest is very different from the ethos of a minister. They're just very different things, because the whole notion of sacrifice, of offering sacrifice, which just doesn't exist for the Protestant minister,
Right.
is very, very different. That doesn't mean there aren't bad priests, God knows. It means that the background and the training and everything else is extremely different. Even though what a priest and what a minister do look very similar, but what's behind them is very different. So when you look at a king, you've got to bear in mind that he comes with a whole bunch of presuppositions, etc., that a politician doesn't have. Remember this, a politician usually, not always, a politician is not a normal human being any more than an artist or an athlete is. I mean professional artist, professional athlete. Why do I say this? Because an athlete will do anything for his sport and does everything for his sport.
Right.
He gives up tons of stuff.
Right.
You know, so he can be the best baseball player, football player, whatever, professional wrestler, tightrope walker, whatever. The artist similarly gives up everything for his art. Well, the politician does the same thing, only for power.
Okay.
That's what they do. And they do things like the artist, like the athlete. They do things that we are not capable of doing. I won't be unkind and say things we wouldn't want to do, but no, they do things that we're not capable of doing, because governing, don't you kid yourself, governing is a skill. It takes work. It takes a certain kind of intelligence that the vast majority of us simply don't have. Just as most of us couldn't go out into Yankee Stadium and knock out a home run, and most of us could not really paint a beautiful painting.
Right.
Most of us couldn't run a city hall meeting.
Right. Makes sense.
Let alone being a governor or a president or a mayor.
Right.
So it's important to bear in mind that the political class in a republic, or in a monarchy, anywhere at all you like, the political class, they don't represent the people on the one hand. On the other hand, they do things we can't do. So, what does all this mean? Well, what it means, to my way of thinking, is that rather than simply destroying the political class, shooting them, lining them up against the wall, etc., etc., what they need is a check on their power. Now,
that includes the monarch. That includes the king.
Well, the king is a bit of a different
That's
story.
different.
It does
Okay.
include the king,
Okay.
but his checks and balances are somewhat different.
Okay.
A lot of them are institutional. Let me take you back in time for a moment. Again, we think of absolute monarchy, but absolute monarchy only really began to arise in the 1500s with the birth of the modern state. Then eventually the modern state apparatus realized it didn't need kings anymore, and you had the revolutions. So then you didn't have kings. You just had the state and the politicians running the show. That's a very encapsulated several centuries of history, but it's what we're left with. I could go into how the judicial class became a sort of subset of the political class, but you get the picture.
Yeah.
All right. What were things like prior to the rise of the modern state? Well, they were very different. You know the difference between power and authority?
What?
Authority is the right to say what should happen.
Okay.
Your doctor can tell you, you know, if you really should have a glass of wine every night, or you're gonna have a heart attack.
Yeah.
He has the authority to say that. He doesn't have the power to make you do it.
Okay.
All right. In the medieval system, if system you could call it, because it was extremely varied, authority was concentrated. It was concentrated in the church. It was concentrated in the king. The church receiving their authority from God, and the king via the church, symbolized by the coronation ceremony and all that sort of thing, via the church and national tradition, if you will. That's where he received his authority from. But power, the ability to make things happen, was very diffuse. The church did have some, and the king had some, but so did the nobility, so did the cities, so did the guilds, so did the peasants, actually, come to think of it. You couldn't throw serfs off their land.
Yeah.
You couldn't foreclose on them. They might not be able to leave it, but you couldn't toss them off it. You see, that you didn't own them.
Yeah.
And if your serfs weren't very good at farming, or didn't feel like doing a good job, there's nothing you could do. That's why you had to try to be a decent lord to your serfs, so that they would produce.
Yeah.
If you weren't, they had ways of getting back at you.
Yeah.
I don't know what it is, my lord. Nothing happened in the North 40.
Yeah.
Sorry. And unfortunately, you couldn't just toss them off the land the way you could if you were a landlord.
Yeah.
And they were renters. So now, mind you, a renter can leave freely,
Right.
but he can be thrown out freely. Everything in life is like that. It's kind of and somehow it never comes out with everything being perfect for you. I don't know why. Anyway, suffice to say that this power then, as I say, was diffuse. So what was a good king like? A good king was like an orchestra leader. He had the ability to coordinate the different factions of the state.
Yeah.
But what about a bad king? Well, Henry VIII was the first of the modern rulers, you might say, so we'll leave him out of it. If you had a bad king, although he could make life unpleasant for the people immediately around him, if you had a bad king, you didn't get tyranny. You got anarchy, as the different powers in the state went to war with each other. And one reason why Henry VIII arose was because of the Wars of the Roses and the terrible civil wars that England had gone through. Henry's father was the victor of them. And when people ask, well, gee, why did people rally behind Henry? It's not so much they rallied behind him, but the terrible civil wars were very much a living memory at that point.
Yeah.
And they didn't want to see that again.
Yeah.
What they didn't realize is that some things are worse than civil unrest.
Yeah.
But just like right now, none of us really know whether the measures we're living with are actually doing the trick or not.
Yeah.
Whether A, they were needed, B, they're effective. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. I don't know, and I don't pretend to know. I don't have an opinion. I'm too much of an historian to have an opinion. Ask me in 25 years, I may have a better sense of what should have been done. And that's how those people were. That's how people in every single chapter of history like that are. They're like you and me right now. So when you ask, well, how could those people have done that? Oh, gee, I guess the way you and I do it, that's how. Anyway.
How about rebelling against a monarchy? Is that ever called for? And if so, how would people do that?
That's a very good question. And it's very much like the just war. Yes, the church has a theory of just rebellion. There are several things, though, that are required. The first is that the tyranny of the king or any ruler has to be so bad that, bearing in mind that whenever you overthrow a ruler, you'll have all sorts of unpleasant side effects.
Okay.
I don't care who the ruler is, whoever he is. If they'd overthrown Stalin, which in my mind would have been a wonderful thing to have done, nevertheless, there would have been all sorts of unpleasantries attendant to that. So The first question is, are things so bad? Is he such a terrible ruler that getting rid of him would justify what's likely to happen afterwards? That's the first question. The second question is there a good chance of winning?
Okay.
Because if you don't have a good chance of winning, you've got no business doing it. You're going to waste people's lives pointlessly. And the third thing is, of course, where's the good of the faith in all of this? And that does relate back to the first. Is the man oppressing the church? Is he keeping people from praying and so forth? The rebels against King Henry, like the plotters against Hitler, actually went through all these questions. And they struggled with them. They really, really struggled with them. They finally said, well, yeah, A, it'll be worse if we don't do something. And B, we have a chance. But that, as you might guess, rarely happens. Like, I must say, a just war. The question of just war is always, is it defensive? Would going to war be worse than not going to war? Do we have a chance of winning? And if your war is not defensive, then it's not justified. Which incidentally allows me to put in a quick ad, as you might say. The Crusades were a defensive war. Just thought I'd point that out.
That's right.
Just thought I'd toss that in for the radio audience. Yeah,
that's important. We're not taught that in school.
Well, no. And so much of what we think we know is what we are taught in school, and so much of it's garbage. But I mean that in the nicest possible way.
Yeah.
And the good news is it gets worse and worse, not just in terms of how things are mistaught, no more kings, well, not just that, but also a lack of stuff being taught.
Right.
I'll give you a concrete example of what I mean. A couple years ago, I went on a tour of the South, which I really enjoyed. I've been all over this great country of ours, and I love it all. I really do. I've yet to see a part of the United States I don't like. But I went to Warm Springs, Georgia, and there I saw the Southern White House where FDR died. If you give him $10, he'll let you sit in the chair where he had his hemorrhage. No, they don't do that. You don't get to sit in the hemorrhage chair, but you do get to look at it. One thing that happens, though, is that after you see the house, or before, you can see the museum, which is a great museum. But it has numbered stations all over it. You can see them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So I looked at that and I asked the ranger, because it's a state facility, it's a state historic park there in Georgia. And I asked the ranger, I said, those look like stations for an audio guide. And he said, yeah, that's what they are. And I said, well, where are the audio guides? He says, oh, we don't have any. I said, okay, well, why don't you have any? And he said, well, because this is, as you know, state facility. And it was the state that paid for the batteries. Well, the children of the public schools in Georgia are no longer taught about Franklin Roosevelt.
Yeah.
And so as a result, the state no longer pays for the audio guides. I said, wait a minute. Hold on. I say, hold on there. Now, if they're not taught about Franklin Roosevelt, that means they're not taught about the Depression or World War II.
Right.
And he says, yeah, that's right. And I said, well, then what are they being taught? And he said, you tell me.
Yeah.
Well, this is a big part of our problem since you opened up with an educated populace voting.
Exactly. That is the big joke. I think.
I mean it.
I think also people. Oh no, I didn't mean to change gears on you, but thinking about, like, I guess maybe people worry about, like, what's the economic model or the ideal economic model behind a monarchy? Is it distributism? What?
Well, you know, it's funny. I don't want to be too much of a spoiler in my book, but of course, mind you, when I think of the ideal monarchy in modern terms, and see, that's the thing, because although monarchy is an age-old system, there are not too many. In fact, there aren't any executive monarchies, if you like. I can't say absolute, but executive monarchies today. And part of the problem you've got is that I neglected to mention this. The big difference between today and the medieval period is that we've reversed everything. Authority is very diffuse amongst the electorate, the people. That's where authority comes from. It's not something really tangible, except at election time where you get promised everything imaginable so you'll vote the right way. Power, however, is concentrated, as this wonderful lockdown shows us. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm not arguing about whether or not it's the right thing to do. I don't know. But the fact that the governments of the earth can put all their toys away and put us all in closets, that tells you something.
That's something. That
tells you something about everything.
Yeah.
About us as people. About me.
Right.
You know, how many times do you hear somebody at the bar get drunk and go on about how, yeah, you know, I'd never stand for that? Oh, of course you would. You do as you're told, you little bunny rabbit. We all would.
Right.
You know, get real, because moderns are like that. Yeah. We are not the people our fathers were. Don't pretend. And you can argue that it's education. You can argue that it's all the hormones going into the water from contraceptives. I don't know what does it.
Yeah.
But we are not. You can argue that the DNA is decaying. I mean, I've heard all kinds of theories. But we are not the people our fathers were. Maybe it's cultural, maybe it's religious, maybe it's this. But I mean, my heavens, we're a very weak bunch.
Yeah.
And what do you do with that? Where do you go with that? Where do you start with that? We accept things, we stand for things that would have been impossible 20 years ago even.
Right.
And yet we have the audacity to judge the past. That's what really burns my bacon more than anything else, is hearing, you know, people yapping about the Inquisition or the Crusades or even 30s Europe.
Right.
You know, trust me, we would have been good Germans. Oh yeah. We would have been very obedient.
Human nature.
Yes, it is human nature, and it's gotten more so.
Yeah.
But at any rate, I do deal with that specific question, and I'm not the only one. Heaven knows. You mentioned distributism. There were a lot along the time that people like Chesterton and Belloc were thinking about distributism. There were a lot of Catholic thinkers in Europe who were thinking along the same lines, usually about different elements of it. And they were looking at Leo XIII and Pius XI, Rerum Novarum Quadragesimo Anno and all that. Lots of questions about what is the just state. One of the big differences between the Middle Ages and now, of course, was the rise of industry and of two new classes that had never existed, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. How to integrate those people into an organic whole, into a society that wasn't at war with itself, but was holistic, if you will pardon the New Agey sound.
Yeah.
Well, they wrestled. Distributism refers specifically to the distribution of property, a wide amount of it. They had other names. Solidarism refers to the notion of class solidarity and national solidarity. Corporatism referred to the idea of industrial organization being a combination of capital, labor, sales, and all that, rather than being in conflict, being pulled together in corporations. Guild socialism was very similar. All of these ideas actually had a lot in common with one another. There's a whole family of theories, which at different places and times were put into effect on larger or smaller scales. The larger scales didn't really have a lot of time to last because they generally came about before or during World War II. And the thing about this kind of a system is that it cannot be run for profit only. It has to have behind it an animating philosophy.
Right.
And that is its, in a sense, its weakness in a place like the United States, because other than that religion of the country and that shared moral consensus that we had, we didn't have an animating philosophy. Not like that. I mean, it was the religion of the country. There was the idea of abstract freedom. But so that kind of a thing was not enough to make an economy work. Pure self-interest, on the other hand. Yeah, you come to the United States, you can become as rich as your abilities and talents will make you. And in lieu of any other interest, it worked pretty well. I mean, there was a lot of downsides. Your ancestors and mine faced the horrors of industrial capitalism in the Northeast. My ancestors, my great-grandfather came down to New England to entertain the mill workers, French Canadians, and their conditions were miserable, which was typical of mills. You'll never hear people saying that the mills were fun places to work in. And the other thing also, that when you read people like Chesterton and Belloc and so forth, and you see them really attacking capitalism, and you're thinking, my God, why are they being so mean? You've got to remember that the capitalism they were attacking is not really exactly the capitalism we know, simply because conditions are much better now than they were then. But as I say, in a system like ours at present, self-interest is the only thing you can appeal to.
Yeah.
A system of the sort that they were talking about, or any of these other people I mentioned, that needs an animating philosophy behind it. Now, of course, the Germans, the Nazis, introduced corporatism around the notion of race. That was their big overarching thing. Yeah. For the Italians, it was the government. It was the state. Mussolini's emphasis was on the state. Everything with the state, nothing against the state, nothing outside the state. Well, great. But, I mean, the one thing you could say for Mussolini is that, in appearance anyway, he managed to get Italy through without it suffering from the Depression, which we forget. Now, that doesn't mean fascism was good, but it does mean that he wasn't entirely stupid and he had something going on, which is one reason why Franklin Roosevelt was a big admirer of Mussolini. People forget that. And he based a lot of the New Deal on what Mussolini did in Italy, especially the NRA, which, not the National Rifle Association, the National Recovery Administration, which the Supreme Court knocked down as unconstitutional. But all of his big building projects and this sort of thing, all comes from Mussolini. If you look today at WPA architecture, and then you go over to Italy and you look at fascist realist architecture, you see the similarities. So what I'm bringing all this to is that similarly, both the popes Leo XIII and Pius XI looked at Catholicism as being the foundational animating principle for such an economic system. Now, where would a king fit into such a system? At the apex, again, like the orchestra leader. But such a system of its nature would not admit of absolute power. Right. See, that's the turnaround. Just as the medieval king couldn't simply do whatever he wanted, so too the leader in such a state as I've described would ultimately not be able to do anything he felt like, because the interests, the entirety of the interests in the state would be represented and would have sufficient power to run their own affairs as well as possible. Where the king would be at home, shall we say, is foreign policy, defense, and if disputes should break out between the different elements. In my book, one of the things that I did, because remember, the king in my book is a foreigner. Now, he's the heir to the Stuart claims to the British throne. He also descends from the French and the Spanish Bourbons. So he's got a connection to each of the different monarchical traditions in our country. Well, one of the things he does is he retains most of the Constitution, which perforce allows the states to, if they want, they can have a state religion, presuming that no individual is discriminated against for not being a member of it. Well, in the book, the first state to take advantage of it is Utah, which immediately establishes Mormonism. But, as my narrator points out, because the governors become appointed rather than elected, the state legislatures are elected, but not the governors. And so, after mentioning that that Utah was the first state to take advantage of that, my narrator adds, however, as of this writing, no Mormon has ever been appointed governor.
Yeah.
Because you see, that was the way in most functioning monarchies. That was the way they did things. If you had a multinational, multicultural monarchy, you either had a local whose loyalty was impeccable, or you put in a total outsider. And of course, the thing about putting in a total outsider is that he would not be part of the different factions, which every place will have. Yeah. In Utah, of course, you'd have you've always had a friction between the Mormons and the Gentiles. So with a Gentile governor, presumably the Mormons can only go so far and no further. It's one of the things that was in my mind when I was writing that is the fact that if you go to Salt Lake City, the cathedral there is gorgeous, La Madeleine.
I remember saying that because everyone donated to it. Everyone, Jew, Catholic, doesn't matter. Everyone gave to it because anything but a Mormon structure.
Exactly. I mean, it is much better than the small number of Catholics there at that time could possibly put together. But yes, it's absolutely true. So at any rate, and that goes to one of the roles of the monarch, which is balancing the different interests of the state so that they operate in harmony.
Right.
Mutatis mutandis, the presidency is supposed to work that way. But the problem is that the president has to be head of state and head of government on the one hand, and party leader on the other. Now, it's interesting to me too, and I explore this in my book, that our system, let's put it this way, there are certain requirements that every system will have just in its working out of its chief. It doesn't matter what you call the system, there are things that arise. The problem, of course, is that the presidency, according to our Constitution, is much more limited than a lot of the roles he's called on to play.
Yeah.
So it really does belong to the head of state to be the patron of the arts and all that kind of stuff. There's no warrant for that in our Constitution. And it's funny to me, and I make this point in the book. I don't want to steal too much of my own thunder, but it's interesting to me that are those presidents of ours that took the most interest in the arts in their official sponsorship were FDR, JFK, and Ronald Reagan, who are arguably the most regal figures we ever had as president. Yeah. I mean, just in terms of their manner and all that kind of thing. But that is a role that nature demands out of the head of state, but it's not something our republic really gives the head of state. And that's one of the things that when people look at the presidency and they say, well, it's become quasi-royal, blah, well, somebody's got to do it.
Right.
I mean, everything that is of value to the country, to the population, but that doesn't turn a dime, who's going to support that? Well, we hope there'll be a lot of donors, but at the end of the day, there's nothing quite like official patronage to really push a ballet company or a theatrical troupe. That's why all over Britain, to this day, you'll see theaters royal. They get very excited. Oh, it's the theater royal. Well, what does that really mean? It means the Queen gives permission. They can call it the theater royal. There's the crown, royal patronage, but people love it.
Yeah.
And to get that royal patronage, people will try to attain a certain level of accomplishment.
Right.
With our system, unfortunately, and this is where, again, the juxtaposition between the structure and the need. In a monarchical system, yes, the king is patron of the arts and all that, but he has taste of a kind. I mean, it may not be good taste. God knows there have been monarchs with really awful taste, but nevertheless, it's human taste. What is the problem with official patronage of the arts in America today? There's no taste involved.
Yeah.
I mean, do you really think that, forget the king, do you really think any sane government official would have gone for piss Christ? I mean,
Yeah.
if we're up to someone's taste,
right?
Excuse me, would you like this in your living room? I'm afraid the cat would get into it. Well, this is you can multiply this by all sorts of things, and I deal with a lot of them in the book. But I have to say, having told you I don't think anything like that is remotely going to happen, I don't. So a good question would be, well, then why did I bother? I'm glad you asked that. No, the reason is twofold, really.
Yeah.
I had two inspirations in writing the book. One is very local. One is, shall we say, more international.
Okay.
The international one was very simple. A friend of mine, a Belgian writer, Christophe Bouffin de Chazal, wrote a book called The End of Democracy.
Yeah.
And he asked me a question, which was very interesting. Or made a statement to me, really. He said that there is not a single body of Catholic monarchist thought in Europe. And that's true, because there are a lot of Catholic monarchists, but one would have to say a lot of Catholic monarchisms, if
Yeah.
you will. Now, they have a lot in common with each other, but it's not something that their adherents see because, of course, they're all about Spain or France or Italy or Poland or Germany or wherever they are. They don't see the similarities. They don't, which I, as an American, am able to see. And so, one of the things I had in mind in writing the book was sort of the creation, if you will, or not the creation, but the stimulating the conversation about those commonalities in Catholic monarchical thinking.
Okay.
So that's the, shall we say, the foreign element. The domestic has to do with the nature of America itself. I said earlier on in this broadcast that the founding fathers had created this religion of America, and they had this pre-existing moral consensus. The America that I was born into on the day JFK was elected was still there. It was still in that place. And the drama of my youth was seeing that collapse.
Yeah.
Was seeing it fall apart. Now, mind you, the nostalgic in me, you know how it is, or maybe you don't yet, but you will one day. There could be a song you hated when you were 18. And just, oh my gosh, no. Well, when you're 28 or 38 or 48 or 58, you hear that song, you still don't like it.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it's not like you'd sit around to rock it out,
But it's grown on you.
It takes you back to being 18.
Yeah.
It reminds you of being the 18-year-old who hated that stupid thing and couldn't understand why it was on the radio constantly. Well, all right. So that nostalgic in me, in a sense, mourns for the country I was born in, and always will. I mourn for the New York I was born in, which is gone with the wind. It's as vanished as Dixie. But having said all that, this leaves us with a big problem. The notion that you'll hear even now repeated over and over and over is America's not a country, it's an idea.
Yeah.
Okay. What happens if that idea is gone?
Right.
Where does that leave the country? I've actually heard people say, well, if America doesn't live up to the American dream, it's no good. I want to throttle such a person. I really do. Because the country is so much more than that. I don't know how many times I've had a dime for every person who has said to me, oh, well, if you don't like our government, you must hate your country. Right. No, smart guy. I served in its armed forces. Mind you, it was during the 80s when peace reigned. Right. I went in the National Guard. We used to say, you'd never say this in the Guard now, God knows. And God bless all of the Guardsmen. But in those days, you used to say, sleep well, America. Your National Guard does. But you could say it in the 80s. Now it's just a cruel joke, just the opposite of the reality. But anyway, this country is the country I was born in. It's the country my ancestors came to. It's patriotism, love of country is a religious virtue.
Right.
And I know this country better than the
virtues now, though.
Yeah, there you go. But, as I always tell people, this country, we did bring in the polio vaccine and the cocktail and the Broadway musical. And, those are pretty good things. When it came to making life more pleasant or enjoyable, we excelled.
Right.
That is what Americans have always been good at. Now, it's not great thought, it's not great art, but it's bloody good. And it's ours. So part of what I was trying to do in the book was explore a patriotism based upon the country. It's history, it's real, not the last best hope of mankind the shining city on the hill,
Right.
waving the flag, American exceptionalism. Nah. But the actual country itself, which, I mean, my gosh, even now, when I'm in New York, my heart sings. It's an incredible, and not just for New York. I mean, my gosh, it's an amazing country, and it's filled with so many things. I always tell people, if you get really upset or overwrought about, of course you can't do it now because we're all under lockdown, but if ever we're allowed to again, if we're taken out of the toy cabinet and allowed to play once more, nothing will make you love this country like a long road trip. Really and truly, you drive to the coast, or forget the coast, you drive up the coast, you drive to Boston. I tell you, 5 years ago, my mother died, and my brother and I, we buried her back home in Fall River, Mass, next to my dad. And we had a requiem. We had two requiems, one in L.A. and one in Holy Innocents in Manhattan.
Yeah.
Well, then we had the mother of all wakes at the Old Town. But the thing is that after we buried my mom, we came back to New York. We drove. We were going to drive through Connecticut, but then my brother and I had an idea. Neither of us had ever been to the wilds of eastern Long Island. So we got on the ferry in beautiful New London, Connecticut, and we took the ferry to Port Orient, Long Island. What a whole different world. And beautiful, beautiful, beautiful place. The funny thing about it, too, is that if you know your history, and that's so important to really loving the country, because unless you know its history, you can't really love it.
Right.
You can't love what you don't know. And if you don't know the history, you don't know it.
Right.
But driving through Long Island, by Yankees, that's why. But as you get closer to the city, the Dutch Reformed churches stop. Descendants of the original settlers are still living out there. Yeah. People forget that, they're very much with us. Well, I mention this because it was seeing a whole new world that you can do in the United States. It just. So, where am I going with this? Well, part of that new king in my book, establishing a secure foundation for the monarchy, was literally wrapping himself in the flag. A new American mythos had to be created. And I won't tell you how he does it, but he does do it. He's a smart cookie, almost as if he had a marvelous advisor. But, or if not an advisor, perhaps a marvelous author. But at any rate, no, it's nothing I did, though, in the book was outside the realm of historical occurrence. And a lot of the scenes in it were actually taken from real life motifs, because they're the kinds of things that really do happen. Most of the chapters in the book, the first couple of chapters, have to do with how the monarchy comes into existence. The rest of the book, which is in a sense the meat of it, I deal with different elements of American life, everything from real estate to education to the arts to the military and so on. And they roughly go into four movements, if you will.
Yeah.
The first is how something or other was done in the Middle Ages, and then specifically in England, how it was altered in colonial America, how it was altered in the Republic, and then how our new king reworked it. And obviously, up until, gosh, it feels like an earthquake's going on there. But obviously, the everything up until the time he takes over is sheer history.
Yeah.
So it really is not, they call it a novel. I don't know what you would call it, frankly. But whatever you would call it, it was fun to write, and as I say, it allowed me to meditate, if you will, upon the American reality. I'll give you a concrete example of what I mean. One of the legal issues that arises from time to time in the United States is who inherited the king's sovereignty in 1783,
Right.
the federal government or the states. Now, people will very quickly come on with answers to that. But when it's come to court cases, every single court, because there are, from time to time, the states, a state or several of them, and the federal government will be at loggerheads over something. And it'll go to court. And if the question is, well, what we're fighting over is something that was inherited from the king, here's the problem. If ever a court ruled that the federal government inherited the king's sovereignty, then the states would be reduced to mere counties, divisions, and the Constitution would be overthrown.
Right.
But if ever a judge ruled that the states inherited the king's sovereignty, then the federal government is guilty of monstrous usurpation.
Yeah.
So, they don't. They avoid it completely. They will make a ruling that only deals with this specific instance, or they'll find some other way to solve it. My favorite, most recent example is maybe 7 years ago now, something like that. There was a big fight over the what you call it, my mind is going. There was a big fight over the public lands. You know, those are the large stretches of government outside the national parks and the national forests. The public lands are government-owned property, mostly in the West. Well, these are in law the successors to the crown lands, which were the crown estate, which goes to the government at independence. Well, a group of states said, we inherited the sovereignty of the king, we inherit the crown lands, we inherit the public lands. So they fought the feds in court. How did the court get out of ruling on it? They said, well, course of conduct. The federal government assumed control with the Northwest Ordinance of the public lands in 1787. Up until now, there has never been an attempt by the states to take it back, and so, course of conduct. That's it. They would not touch the question. For absolutely, completely understandable reason, because to rule either way would create an impossible situation. Well, in my mythical monarchy, that problem is solved. The king is king of the United States and also of each state separately. The way Queen Elizabeth is Queen of Canada,
Right.
the Queen of Ontario, Queen of Quebec, Queen of Manitoba, and so forth. It's what they call the crown and right of Canada, the crown and right of Manitoba. Same in Australia. Well, similarly with land ownership. Now, we inherited, of course, the English system of common law. And in that system, there are two kinds of ownership. Allodial, there's a word for you. Allodial. And if you're the allode, it means you are the supreme land. It's your property. There's nobody else. And then there is feudal ownership, which means you own it under a lord. And specifically in England, and thus wherever the common law goes, the king. Now, it's on the basis of feudal law that you have eminent domain. Because if the king, in law, we're talking again legal fictions, it doesn't really work that way anymore, but if the king needs to make a highway, a road, a fort, a lighthouse, something that the good of the general good of his subjects requires, he can take back his property. But because an Englishman's home is his castle, he has to pay for it. All right. So that's what eminent domain was, and it comes from feudal law. Okay. In our country, the courts have never ruled whether we have feudal or allodial ownership.
Yeah.
And for good reason. Because if they ruled we had allodial ownership, then you couldn't have eminent domain. But if they ruled we had feudal ownership, who's the lord of the land?
Right.
So they're always they don't.
Right.
Interestingly enough, though, eminent domain, which as a concept belongs to a monarchy, has been taken by our free republic into places it's never gone in any monarchy. It started in the 50s. It was extended from what I've explained. The Supreme Court of the United States, the supreme masters of all this survey and owners of our souls, there's nothing wrong with being owned by judges. People are constantly saying to me, "Oh, the children of Israel, God wasn't happy with them wanting a king." It was Thomas Paine, by the way, who first came up with that argument and laughed because he didn't believe in the Old Testament. He told John Adams it was funny how people would swallow it. But at any rate, well, he knew what he was doing.
Yeah.
But when people come up with that to me, I say, well, I don't see what you're complaining about. We're ruled by judges, and it does us great.
Yeah.
We're Susanna's judges instead of Samuel, but never mind. Anyway, so the thing is that the Supreme Court in the 50s extended the concept of eminent domain to seizing areas that a city judge blighted. That's where urban renewal came from. And of course, urban renewal would mean the death of tons of neighborhoods, and they're usually, not always, but usually, they're being replaced by piles of rubble, which are often still there. And then in the zeros, I guess, Reno versus New London, they extended it further so that your local government can take your property if they can find someone who'll pay them higher taxes on it.
Yeah.
Well, an Englishman's home may be his castle, but an American's isn't.
Right.
Because, of course, they live under a horrible monarchy, and we live under a free republic.
Right.
So, anyway, so that's about all I can tell you.
No, that's great stuff, Charles. I really appreciate it. Loaded with information. Like I said, I hope all of our listeners get your book, Star Spangled Crown. You're a legend. I'd love to do this again sometime. Thank you so much for all your time and all the great information. I appreciate it.
You're very welcome. And remember that even though you live in New York, your heart is in the Garden State.
That's right. Thank you very much, Charles. God bless you. Stay safe.
God bless. Take care.
Take care.